thank you for joining us today. Welcome to T-Space Architecture Lecture Series 2022. This is the second in a series of 9 public lectures organized by T-Space within the framework of the Architecture Residency program. I am Irini Tsahrelia. I'm a practicing architect and an educator in New York and currently directing the residency program for T-Space. I've been instructing our residents since the inauguration of the program, which was about 6 years ago in 2017, along with Stephen Hall and an incredible series of guests who have joined us over the years. It is now the 3rd year we run the program online with our beautiful T-Space team and our coordinator, Marisa Espe, and this year's resident host, Yasmina Parto, who's here with us. Hi, Yasmina.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today.
Yasmina is the co-host for this event, also an architect currently practicing with Stephen Hall Architects. For the audience who's new, does not know T-Space, T-Space is a non-profit organization. It's an initiative of the Stephen Maron Hall Foundation, and it focuses on arts, education, design, and ecology. The T-Space programming supports the coming together of those arts: architecture, art, music, poetry, photography, and other arts that we will talk about today. In addition to the residency program, which runs once a year, T-Space produces this series of coordinated and curated events every summer called the Synthesis of the Arts. And this takes place on the grounds in Rhinebeck, and they focus on music, poetry, and art or architecture. So one such event is actually on show right now, Susan Frecon's exhibit, which is up until 2 more days, the 10th of July, and then coming up on July 17th, a show by Arlene Shehet called Coupled Off, with additional music and poetry readings. Arlene Shehet will also be lecturing for the residency program on July 20th, so you can see in the chat a link to register for that lecture if you're interested. And in the chat, you will see additional information about how to visit T-Space gallery hours, how to schedule a tour, and so on and so forth. So the lecture you're joining today by Paul Warchol is part of the Architecture Residency program, which is this 25-day intensive that takes place every July. And our residents are here with us on the panel from different parts of the world: Canada, Minnesota, California, Ithaca, Greece. Hi, everyone. Yahya, Teresa, Isabella, Lafina, Stephen, Jingwen, thank you for being here. Beautiful panel. So I wanted to add a very big thank you note for those supporting T-Space and the residency program. We have a beautiful scholarship program which is growing every year. We couldn't be more grateful for those who have offered scholarships and made it possible for the residents to join with a full scholarship, including Silman Scholarship, the Pulimut Scholarship, which is this year honoring Jenny Crane, the J.M. Kaplan Fund, the Carpilero Scholarship, the Al-Held Scholarship, 100 Mile Scholarship, and additional support with Elise Jaff, Jeffrey Brown, and Stan Allen. We could not be more thankful and grateful for your support, and we very much welcome other people's support for the program. You can see the links in the chat how to make this contribution and support education, architecture education. Now, the theme for 2022 is called Cosmic Dust, Space and Time. It's a continuation of the exploration we have tested before in the residency program, and we're inviting the residents to experiment with design and focus on critical thinking and what thought experiments through design. So with that, I will pass it on to our co-host Yasmina to describe briefly the structure of the webinar, and then our resident Isabella Cangerini will introduce our lecturer for today. Thank you. Yasmina? Let's give her a moment.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Sorry, I lost my connection for a second.
Just for a second, you're good.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you everyone for joining again. I'm just going to go through some information about the lecture today. The presentation is going to be approximately 35 minutes and by Paul Warchol. Thank you, Paul, again for accepting our invitation. It's a pleasure having you. And we have approximately 15 minutes of Q&A question led by our panelists and the audience. Please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen as well as the chat function. I would encourage you to ask your questions throughout and put your questions in the chat during the lecture. You don't have to wait until the end. And we will be populating chat with some relevant information. Please make sure you check that out. And without further ado, I would like to welcome one of our residents, Isabella, to introduce our speaker, Paul. The floor is yours, Isabella.
Hi, good morning. So Paul Warchol is a photographer. Paul has been photographing architecture across the globe for almost 40 years. His commissioned photography has covered a broad range from work of some of the most notable modern architects to the Great Pyramids. Warchol's more well-known clients include Stephen Hall Architects, Pei Cobb Freed and Partners, Zaha Hadid Architects, Gabellini Shepherd Associates, Peter Marino Architects, the Rockwell Group, ADIS Hong Kong. His noteworthy projects photographed include the Bank of China, Hong Kong, Goldman Sachs headquarters in New York City, Eli and Edith Burroughs Museum in East Lansing, Michigan, Kiasma Museum in Helsinki, Princeton's Lewis Center, and the TED Theater installation in Vancouver, Canada. His past books that have featured Warchol's photographs include Loft with Mayor Russ Monticelli, Architecture in Detail series with Oscar Riera Ojeda Rockport, and 12 books on architecture and design published by Edizioni Larchi Volto Milan. Thank you so much, Paul, for joining us today, and we really look forward to your talk.
Well, thank you all, panelists, and thank you, Stephen, Dimitra, and Irene for letting me tell you all what I've been up to for the past 4 decades. So I guess the first slide, Hong Kong, 1990, 2 strikingly different buildings dominate the skyline. Foster's Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank headquarters and I.M. Pei's Bank of China. 2 titanic design visions compete for attention. Next slide. Click. And then this photo suggests a 3rd entity vying for attention here. The photographer, me, is trying for some narrative, smashing the buildings together and creating a visual trap for us to consider. When thinking about this opportunity to speak at T-Space, this meme kept presenting itself to me. This guy, next slide. Imagine a recent European emigre arriving at some rough town out in the American West in the 1880s. He studied with the best teachers that Europe had to offer and dreams of Mozart while he plays a soundtrack for a population that appreciates him, but maybe doesn't exactly understand what he does. Next slide. And he's hopefully not injured or worse in an altercation. Architects have their heroes, Corbusier, Mies, Wright, Louis Kahn, and I'm specifically saying heroes of the older men that were shown in the first 2 slides. And I was fortunate to work for Ezra Stoller, who embodied the education of an architect with the brilliant lyrical photographic instincts. Educated as a photographer, I dream of Aceh, Walker Evans, Dion Arbus, and Robert Frank. And in the past 41 years, I've also led in the aforementioned architectural pantheon of that I mentioned earlier. And fortunately also Zaha, Toshiko Mori, Liz Diller, Kathy Cha, and Diane Lewis. Next slide. And then the next slide. I have photographed Stephen Hall's work since 1984's Cohen apartment. This collaboration is one of many that illustrates the discipline of architectural photography to need engaging architecture in front of one's lens. The last 2 years of COVID have slowed down the pace of shooting for me and allowed me to mine my archive of that 40-odd years of work. I've been scanning and applying new technology, new for me, technique to revisit much of my work. I used to cling to nostalgia for shooting 4x5 film, but scanning and subjecting transparencies to extreme Photoshop scrutiny show the limits of that medium for me. You can go forward, next slide. These slides are examples of things that I've photographed for Stephen over the years. And I've used the open-ended of this nature of this invitation to indulge in myself and basically just presenting photos that I like. Cosmic dust suggests the conundrum of a legacy, if one cares about that, and photos that don't last all that long compared to buildings, so that everything will be dust, hopefully later rather than sooner. Next slide. And if you will indulge me now, at a comfortable space, some photos. These should do the talking rather than me. Next slide. And then at a comfortable pace, we could view the next batch of photos. And please, if anybody has a question, chime in. You could stop here for a second. I really love what black and white negatives look like as an object, and that's what we have here. And from this, we get, next slide, that. And that always is a miracle to me, even if the first thing was done with a scan and this didn't appear in a tray of water, tray of chemicals, it's still a wonderful thing that one yields the other. Next slide, please. There was no pressure on these for clients to receive scans. So a lot of this is my indulging myself and getting to look at things that I didn't look at, haven't looked at for quite a long time. Go back to that. Robert Venturi puts his Pantheon on the wall above his dining room. And proceed. Next slide. I have to confess, some of the later ones are actually digital images, but I like them anyway, so I wanted to make sure they were in here. And right about now, we could stop. This is the 1980 Democratic National Convention in Madison Square Garden. You could tell it's 1980 by the cigarette. And this is a good place to stop for a second. I have a long history of shooting high-end corporate spaces and high-end residential spaces in Manhattan. And early on in that experience, I began to appreciate some of the views that these offices and homes provided to the occupants. When the shoot crew broke for lunch, I would often stick the lens of my 4x5 camera out the window to shoot some of these normally inaccessible aspects of the city. Some of these are grand vistas and some are little tiny bits. They were normally shot on black and white film, as the color film was reserved for the job at hand, but I would sometimes sneak color in here and there. All of these were shot on film and mostly scanned and digitized over the past 2 years. And after a while, I noticed this became a body of work. So I started to add photos from other situations in New York, and then occasionally would shoot things to add to it as well. But this is essentially New York City from the 80s, 90s, and the early aughts. And feel free to make any comparisons to the city of now. You may start. You can see I still not sure whether color or black and white works best for some of these. Any of the pictures of people from this period, no one is looking at their iPhone. It's not exactly a travelogue, but it is somewhat organized by geography. So I believe that's the last picture of that group. So as I said, I'm not sure what these add up to, but I find them personally important. They personally record something I was up to. And I've begun printing them, thinking that they should be seen in other ways.
Oh, this is incredible, so eye-catching and holding the attention in so many different interesting ways. And I'm very curious how this experiment plays out of gathering this material, looking at it again, and putting them together in the sequence of creating a narrative. Does it create a narrative? Is there a coherence of this group? How does it work? How does it feel like looking at those again, revisiting after a while, distancing yourself from it and looking at it again?
That's a good, that's a good point, and exactly one of the things I wrestle with. I have a couple of different folders with different edits, different sequences of them. Early on, if you look at the I don't want to equate this with Robert Frank's work, but if you look at that famous photo book, The Americans, the editing in that is mind-boggling. Just the one picture then begets the next picture, and then it amplifies itself. So down the road, whatever this body of work becomes, I would hope that it all holds together and adds up to something. It's almost a little, it's not Bernice Abbott in the 1920s photographing New York, or Ache photographing Paris in the I guess 1890s or early 1910s. It's a little too recent for me, but I almost can't wait for another 30 years to pass, except I'll probably be gone, so that would not be good. But I'd like to get even some more distance from it that way. I guess the other thing that kind of, I don't know if it's a crutch or not, but the fact that many of them are in black and white in this day of iPhone color kind of gives them a certain stick togetherness. But it's, as I said, there were a bunch of different reasons why I did that. And it's one of the reasons is that I like black and white. So I guess that's sort of.
It's interesting the pace of viewing them too, that starts creating new narratives, new free associations for every viewer. I was thinking, part of our residency program, we were looking at La Jetée, the film, which is actually made up of small stills with Chris Baker. And it almost reminded me of that there is an underlying story or multiple underlying stories that emerge as we see the content, and how useful this is actually for architects, architecture education too, to start compiling those sort of narratives, reshuffling, re-editing, or revisiting those and see what kind of narratives emerge.
Yeah, there's not a preconceived narrative here. I mean, this is almost like an automatic, exactly. An automatic thing, because I didn't know what I was going to see when I would get into these situations. So once again, that being the original premise. So the reshuffling really is a great thing to do, and some are way more successful than others, and some cause some images to be discarded, and other ones say, oh, maybe I better go scan that one and see if I should add that, see how that one feels in this mix. But I think in terms of New York views, I've exhausted my archive in terms of what's in there.
It's interesting to think about that in terms of the streams of information that we receive today on social media or other, where it's linear, you're scrolling up and down. And this reshuffling, I find it really useful and as part of the creative process, that what sticks and what doesn't stick, and how does that all work together, and having the ability to revisit and think through this material and new ideas emerge. There is rhythm, there is density, there is so much going on here that is incredible to look at, in addition to the earlier part of the presentation where we see those interiors or other well-known, really iconic elements that have already a set composition. Right here, there is a freedom or kind of in the. I'm curious actually if you're interested in how you think about composition in taking those pictures, in framing or setting up each picture. I know you mentioned some of these are taken from apartments that are views that you rarely ever have or have once and then be difficult to go ever back again. So these are kind of unique moments.
Yes, that a couple of things. From being assigned to photographs, let's say a new skyscraper in New York or a new whatever, I know how hard it is. I knew all along how difficult it was to get access to a building. You'd have to bribe the super, and then maybe he'd get a phone call and say, no, you can't do it, or you can't, you don't have the access. So it's very, very difficult to get that. And other times it's not difficult. So I took all of these as gifts, and I began to be sensitized and ready to ready to shoot. I knew if I was going up into a building, there was always a good chance that something might present itself. How do I compose things? I try to compose things in the service of not of composition, but of just, well, I guess justice, like doing things justice, letting them breathe, letting them I don't know, be what they are. I mean, the whole city is built up of proportions. And when you take a picture of New York City, you're taking a picture of a series of proportions. So it's just, you're making all of those proportions sort of work together. There's golden sections, and there's Fibonacci series, and there's all these things going on, and you're just sort of like noticing them and trying to conduct them into something that will I said do it justice, certainly not take away from those vibrations.
I think that's great, that to do it justice. So, and there is this, Isabella or any of the residents who want to take on, please do so, if you like. Otherwise, yes, Isabella, you want to do that?
Oh, yes. I'm curious how you decide what images are best with figures, because I've noticed that sometimes in your photos the figures play quite an important role, like that one with the guy with the cigarette.
Yeah.
And how you decide like what the appropriate composure is for a photo.
It was when I was, I'm going to back up even more. Architectural photography mostly required using a 4x5 camera, which I was almost going to set up and show as, you know, in the background here as a prop, because it looks like a box kite. It has a front and a back, and an accordion bellows in between it, and a lens, and a black cloth for looking at the ground glass on the back of it, and the whole thing weighs 40 pounds, and it's and at the time the film was 10 or 15 or $20 a sheet, depending on what kind of film you used. And if you were shooting people, let's say walking on the sidewalk in front of the Seagram's building, you never knew what you were going to get, because you couldn't you couldn't look at the screen in the back of the camera to see what you got like you can now. So you always ran the risk of blowing through $100 worth of your client's film, so that you would and you might get, there are good blurry figures and there are bad blurry figures, and you might get one or the other, and you never really got that. The best example of this, and you should look it up, is Ezra Stoller's picture of the Guggenheim, which shows two nuns from a local convent walking in front of it. And if you look at that picture, you will smile. So that's I would recommend you know, finding that picture online and looking at it. It's available, and it's to me it's the best thing, and maybe it's something to aspire to. It's much easier now adding people to pictures, obviously for obvious reasons. You can shoot until you get what you want, and you can even add one person from the left side to the right side. You know, you can add it in post-production. So that's a nice part of what's possible now. When I originally went to art school, I thought I was going to be a painter, and but I quickly switched to photography, and I find that these days, working in Photoshop, I'm calling upon my painterly skills to combine and add and lighten and darken and correct color and you know, make the final image, which is never really final.
Great. I see that George Beckwith has a question. He says, beautiful images. Can you talk about your process of working with architects, getting to the essence of the buildings?
Yes, thank you, George. Time usually helps. If you have the luxury of spending a day just making notes prior to actually shooting, that's one great thing to do. But often, you know, you take a plane somewhere and you have to shoot that day because, you know, you found out that the next day is going to be cloudy or rainy or otherwise. So sometimes you're forced to shoot. But I often find that the return visits or the second or third day are the most productive ones. But once in a while you get you nail pictures on the first day. There's like a bell curve of the first day, and then all of this activity happens, and then it sort of falls off, almost like a brief love affair or something. So so it's best to walk the building with the architect, or, you know, hear what they have to say, but don't write any of that down in stone, just to sort of figure out what's important. One thing I really hate is when an architect starts talking about what the building could have been and how things were value engineered out and how things were oh, they didn't do this part right, and you know, this, and that just starts to makes that bell curve into this kind of flaccid. So it would be important for architects to maintain a high level of enthusiasm for their project so they can infect the photographer.
In fact, I like that, to infect the photographer. It's true. Thinking about those, the comment, Isabella's comment earlier about the character, or the figure, the role of people, and to mention something about heroes earlier on in your presentation. the heroes that each architect has, which may be different than what you conceive of as a hero in a shot. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
You mean the heroes that a photographer might have?
Yes, or how they, I believe you mentioned something about each architect having their own heroes. I don't know if you meant figures that trigger certain narratives in the projects or other mentors, or how you meant it. I would like to hear a little bit more about that and how that relates to your work in photography and heroes in your shoots.
Yes, well, I'll just go back to my education back at Cooper in the 70s. You know, there were photographers that were revered, like I mentioned, Walker Evans, Robert Frank, Dion Arbus, Eugene Ache, Gary Winograd, Lee Friedlander, and I mean, we would literally like adopt some of the styles in our shooting during the week that we would then present at class, and we would kind of regurgitate. And I know from talking with architects, I'm married to an architect, that there are definitely people that value what Mies did in the Farnsworth house, so you could then see it show up 50 years later somewhere else, or what a curtain wall looks like compared to the Seagram building, or there's stuff that is definitely adopted. I mean, I know the landscape is different from what it was in 1940, 1950, and 1960, when just these guys were doing this, and just these guys were paying for this. So that whole thing is different, but still, it's I'm assuming that heroes are still, people are, let's say, if not heroes, people are certainly impressed by people. So, and once again, I come to architecture not as a particularly big thinker, but as an observer, as that piano player at the saloon right before the bar fight. Well, okay.
Thank you, Paul. Sorry, go ahead, please.
Nothing.
No, I just had a question, something when we were going through your photos, I always think about black and white versus colored, and the quality that black and white photo has and the quality of colored photo. And sometimes I find that black and white captures the moment differently than a colored photo does. And for some reason, since I'm not a photographer, it's just intuition for me that I notice different qualities in a black and white photo versus a colored photo. And I want to understand, what is your take on that? And how would you see that? How would you pick your black and white photos versus the colored one? The light is different in a black and white. Colored sometimes distracts the photo, at the same time brings so much quality. I want to know what is your thought on it?
That's funny. When I was in art school, the photo scene was just beginning to embrace color photography as art. Stephen Shore, Joel Meyerowitz, and now it's not even thought about. But at the time, it was fairly groundbreaking that art photography had to have been in black and white. Color photography was the photography of Life magazine and National Geographic and whatever. It wasn't the serious stuff. And the frankly, the technology was kind of bad and expensive. So you really had to be a very successful artist to make good color photographs. I mean, and now, of course, you can just make something black and white at the flick of a slider or a button. So I don't. So I like the. It's not actually abstract, except it's abstract on another dimension. You know, there's the. It's almost like it's the. If color would be the fifth dimension, black and white would just be the 2.5 dimension or something. There's this thing. I know back when we were shooting film, the color film would often fail in certain ways and wouldn't be able to record mercury vapor light, or fluorescent light would look funny. And there were all these hoops we had to jump through to make all of that stuff work properly. Things that no one would even think about doing now. So, and I've even visited some of those pictures and tried to correct some of those.
Thank you, Paul. I love the dimensions, the dimensionality that you mentioned, that almost like the purity of a black and white photo versus the colored photo, but it maybe puts an attention to different elements. You can capture different elements in a black and white photo versus the busyness of the colored photo. I really love the way you put it in dimensions, 5 dimension versus 3.5 dimension. It's very interesting.
Yeah. Let's not get into string theory.
Yeah. Everything is connected. Let's see if there's any other question from the residents.
I have a question. It may sound silly, but I always had the impression that when a photographer enters a space, an interior or an exterior, sees an exterior and he has in his mind that he needs to photograph, he has to work on it. He or she experiences the space in a different way. Like, for example, you have a window and light coming in. Perhaps you don't want to go there to warm yourself. Perhaps you see it as a frame, or you see it differently. So I was wondering if you could speak about what is the experience of a photographer of a space, if that makes sense.
Yes, I think there's a like a musician. You know, if you think of a concert pianist bringing his famous flying his favorite piano to Paris because he has a concert in Paris, because he knows how that piano will respond, as opposed to using the piano that the concert hall has. There's a feedback loop that comes with you and your knowledge of lenses and how each lens describes space, that is not really thought about, but is intuitive. And it's got to be like a musician playing a Stradivarius or playing it just has to be like an extension of yourself. So I think there's this feedback loop of, in fact, when I'm not shooting and I have no camera around, I still see things as if, oh yes, I would have the 24 millimeter on here. And, so I still have this, and so it has to do a bit with how the technology and the photographer and who the photographer is react. And the technology means the physics of it, the geometry of what the lenses can do, and this is without getting into intention. And maybe you're in a restaurant that smells good or smells bad, and so you have a different attitude as to whether it's going to be how you're going to proceed with it. And as I said, it's bad when photographers poison the shoot with when the architects poison the shoot with comments about what it might have been and what the problems are. So I mentioned lenses because the tech metal glass part of it's important, but there are other things that your biography brings to each situation, and that you know, what book you read last month, what glass of wine you had last night. There's lots of things that make it sort of different, and I guess being attuned to all those things is one way to proceed.
Thank you. That makes sense.
Good. I'm glad it was a reach, but you know, thank you. Thank you for the question.
I kind of have a question, jumping off of Lafina's point. I've been just thinking about, through all the images, this kind of dance between narrative and chance, and especially how you kind of talked about how that changed as the technology changed. Do you feel like that's something that you always have to hold as a photographer, this kind of narrative, either from the architect or your own narrative, and then, you know, whatever's happening on that day? Or is that kind of more so shaped now that we have, in a sense, more control with different, you know, tools?
Well, the more control means the expectations are higher. But I have to believe that luck is always a part of photography. And, you know, it's not high stakes luck, like the luck that requires the engineer to make sure that the bridge doesn't fall down or something like that. It's not emergency room triage luck, but it's nonetheless, it's still luck. The luck could be the cloud, you know, the sky clearing for a half hour while you needed the sun to be in that one spot. Or it could be the two nuns walking in front of the Guggenheim Museum in that Ezra Stoller picture. Or it could be, you know, just looking over your shoulder as you're packing up the camera to see that the sun is hitting the building in a great way that you did not anticipate. So you better get the camera out again. I mean, it's a bunch of things. I mean, it almost sounds like being at war, you know, the luck of people who survive and don't survive. But maybe not a good month to bring up metaphors like that. But, you know, luck. I don't know anything about, I don't know how karma works here, but it feels like I've been lucky, but I don't want to tempt karma.
Oh, sorry. Can I ask a question?
Yeah, Chairman.
Oh, yeah, so I noticed you mentioned that like social media and like technologies like Photoshop are kind of altering the landscape of photography. So I was wondering if you could go further on this, like, because with social media and the internet, like literally photography has become something that a billion people could do every day, instead of like something accessible to like a privileged few. So I was wondering if you could talk about how this kind of new forces in this field could be potentially like shaping photography as an art.
Yes, as someone who used one of those 40-pound box kite shaped cameras, I had a feeling at the time that there were maybe 15 people in the United States that knew how to use that camera for architecture, and maybe it was 40, but still it was a pretty special, rare thing. So you're right, it was exclusive. But it's like photography is the same thing with music or Twitter comments, or you know, there's 1.5 billion more of us than there were in 1980 now. So and there's I don't know how to judge it or evaluate it. I know it is what it is. It's not going to go away unless they stop making electricity. So that's maybe another reason I welcomed today as a way of showing what I did with these funny pieces of film and that 40-pound camera so I do posit that against the landscape that you described. But I don't know what today's landscape will amount to. I'm kind of glad that people are more visually sophisticated and that their standards are higher. And I mean, I know the phones and cameras now do a lot of the work that had previously made the techniques exclusive, but I don't. I guess we could ask the question, what does it mean that there are 8 billion people now rather than 5 billion people 30 years ago? It all seems to be good, but and an opportunity. So let's proceed with generosity rather than zero sum. I think that's the only thing you can do.
Thank you.
I hope that was helpful.
Definitely.
In architecture education and in practice as well, we engage very much in photographing models and photographing throughout the progress and development of a project, the development of an idea. And this is very important for our residency program too, where we're really using that lens to explore space through models and light, of course. So how do we capture that moment where the light is right, but not as a final product, but as part of a process of better understanding space, better understanding that idea, and see how it evolves. And models are great tools to do that. So you have the camera as a tool, you have the model as a tool, you put those two together and start exploring the potential of space. So this is something that we will dive into once the project or each project develops. This is very early on in the residency prep program. It's just week 1. But I don't know if you would like to add anything to that, or your thoughts about model photography, actual space photography. Any thoughts here?
Well, model photography was an even more arcane part of architectural photography, and there were a few specialists, and I think there are a few people that still do it, because I know computer renderings can do pretty much what a model photographer would do at this point. But I know from being in the archive and in Stephen's office that there are models everywhere, and many of them are beautiful objects, like a beautiful vase or a beautiful piece of whatever. They're considered in all these ways. So I know they're useful tools, but it almost seems that the useful tools could be as well done with computer rendering programs that show what the sun will be on, what angle the sun will be at on 8:02 on June 16th in 2028. But I think you guys make beautiful models as objects. And for me, photographing them, although I've not ever done that, I would have to treat them like pieces of sculpture, not as design tools.
I think that the model photography is actually quite different from a rendered image, and that you can even simulate light much better with the actual model photography of an actual model under a true real sun condition than any rendering could ever do, even though the light may be accurate at 8:02 in a certain time and date and place. You can simulate that with the model, and those photographs, I feel, are much more alive and bring us into the space much more truthfully than any rendering would ever do. So I very much would advocate for physical model photography, which is a miniature version of it's a very different endeavor, I'm sure, as photographing live one-to-one scale objects. But the beauty there is also that you can immerse yourself into the interior of a space. And as you said, it may be the sculptural qualities of it, but also using this as a tool to explore the interior and exterior connections. That's something that is curiously very, very beautifully done with just manually photographing models as opposed to rendering. So we're very much advocating for photography with natural light as a tool to explore as part of the process.
I think this is just another form of the argument of vinyl records versus CDs versus MP3s versus me photos from negatives versus digital pictures. Like I said, that none of the New York pictures were digital at all. I think it's interesting that you hold dearly looking at what's happening on an actual model versus a digital rendering on a screen. I think that's really interesting. And attractive, a good thing, I think. And it touches base with the previous question about the digital landscape and the amount of pictures that are there. I guess in some ways, it's like you're trying to hold back, or you are holding back for good reason, a flood of otherwise easy things by purposely making it hard.
Yes, it's interesting you think that way. There's a certain ease in, I know the difficult part is making the physical model as opposed, I don't know that it's harder or easier, but it seems more natural and yes, it's not a binary thing, and I wouldn't want the conversation to go this or that or which one is better. And I'm sure
Right.
all the residents are very well equipped, and architects from a very young age now are very fluent with digital tools, so they have both at their disposal. They have their iPhone and they can take pictures and videos instantly, and they also have the digital technology, and playing with both or even synthesizing this world that mixes real light conditions and simulated ones. I think it's really interesting.
The light, the model that you've made exists, the light falls on it, and you consider it differently than you do, like right now I'm looking at a screen. I mean, that's a different way of perceiving. It's a different kind of perception. And the perception of the light actually landing on a I don't know, piece of plaster or copper or whatever the thing is made out of is an actual, is a thing. It's the thingness. I don't, that's, who knew that thingness was going to be an actual thing to be challenged.
I would like to ask the residents maybe for the one last question, if you have any question for Paul. Thank you so much, Paul, for the great conversation.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, of course.
Fine?
Yes.
Just a very quick, and I hope this wasn't covered because I was kind of cut out mid presentation. But I'm really curious as to, you spoke about how you choreograph moments, and we just spoke about the kind of technological shift. I'm wondering how does this technological shift and like the over accuracy and over control affect the pacing and more importantly the intention behind how you photograph a space? Let's say previously using film and older, more let's say more intimate forms of film versus the kind of hyper fast digital response that we get with current tools.
Yeah, I think about that all the time. And in architectural photography, it wasn't all that intimate, because, as I said, there's no way of hiding the camera. The camera was, I mean, maybe you're not using intimate quite the same way that I'm describing right now, but and the techniques for getting the color to work right were so excruciating when I think back on them. Literally getting up on ladders and undoing fluorescent light bulbs and swapping out filters on the camera, and then tripling 3 different exposures on one sheet of film so that the incandescent light would have one filter and the fluorescent light would have another filter, and then you'd open the shades and the daylight coming in would have another filter, and then combining it onto one piece of transparency film. It really it could kind of crimp your style, because you started to do photos that only were achievable using those techniques. If you couldn't close the windows, or you couldn't get rid of one of the light sources, or if one of the light sources was unknown or temperamental, you might as well just go home, because the expectations were still pretty high, but what you had to do was kind of a little insane. So now I shoot, I make sure I do bright exposure so I can make sure the shadows look the way they're supposed to look. And I shoot dark exposures so that the highlights, I can grab those back. And then in the middle of it all, I can choreograph people walking through the picture, or I'll just wait for people to walk through the picture and become those nuns in front of the Guggenheim for me. God, I hope you guys look up that picture. So I shoot differently now because I can, and the expectations are such that, I don't know, I guess the expectations are still to give me a call because I have a certain way of taking pictures. So, and I try to be true to that. I don't know if that's the final answer or not, but that's one thing I try for.
It's cool how you were talking about the negative and how it really mystifies the scene or what you're looking at. And it's interesting how maybe waiting for the negative or to develop and looking how it's like a demystifying process almost. And now it's quite the opposite. When you have the photo and you can apply an effect or a filter digitally, and you're trying to mystify it as opposed to see what emerges from that negative. And I think the beauty of that negative, I'm glad you added that in your presentation, and what it eventually reveals, that there is this unknown element of the film, which is it's very hard to simulate. I don't know what parallels one would think of today, but I see it more as a mystifying as opposed to a demystifying process.
Well, it was also terrifying. Imagine going to Egypt for 10 days and shooting for a magazine and not actually seeing the pictures until you got back. You got all of that film, like an entire big suitcase of film back to New York, and you didn't know if it was going to be X-rayed or messed up some way. And it fortunately, it generally worked out. After 9/11, all film, all checked luggage got X-rayed. I literally had to start FedExing boxes of film to Wyoming because I couldn't check it on the plane. So it was really and also if you brought it on the plane, they would want to. It was a box like this with tape on it. They would want to see what's in the box. So you couldn't really do that either. So it's funny that it all kind of adjusted itself in a way that it had to. And also, as I get older, I'm glad that the camera doesn't weigh 40 pounds anymore. One thing I want to mention is that all the digital cameras are super fast, and they're super autofocus, and they're super, super computational. But I try to still use the digital camera like the view 4x5 view camera that I used to use. I try to use it very slowly and methodically, and some would say ploddingly, but I try to consider in that same way.
As we talk, I realize I'm curious whether, to any of our residents, have you used the film? Has anyone tried, or?
Yes, I've tried in the past though.
Mm-hmm.
I remember I had, because I was born in there, the digital camera was. So when I used the analog camera, I had the stress that, oh, I don't have a lot left, so I have to use them really carefully.
Yeah, at the end of that 10-day trip to Egypt, I don't think I had any film left, and that's not why I came home. But it was still, and you can't really buy that film. You could not buy that film in Egypt, so it was, it was you were very aware of your consumables.
Yes. I want to be very respectful of everyone's time. It would be great, Paul, to have you critique our residents' photography if you're available later on as it develops. When we see the model photography that we were talking about, perhaps it would be nice to get your eyes on it. Sort through the photos.
Well, it's a whole other discipline, but I seeing the models in the archive building, I thought was it was like being in the Cairo Museum.
Yes.
I don't know if you've ever, the old Cairo Museum. It was just like shelves and shelves of beautiful, interesting, idiosyncratic stuff, like being in a Borges novel or something.
That's a very well put indeed. Yes, over 2,000 models at the archive building, so it's an incredible resource. Is there any other thoughts or comments, or we can maybe time to close the discussion here?
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
everyone.
Thank
you, Paul.
Thank you all. Thank you all very much.
It was a great presentation, very inspiring, and something that was very interesting to me, the way you were explaining the process that you had with back in the day, comparing to the way you take the photography, and how this process in understanding how you take the photos, the shadows, the elements that come in the photos and make the photos the way it's supposed to be. I think for the new generation, my generation, it's really important to understand that aspect and see the process of the photography when we were taking a photo with just one shot of an iPhone. That was very interesting. Thank you, Paul.
Well, thank you, and I hope that I guess the pictures will be visible in the subsequent bit of media.
And that is true. We will have all the photos, actually the lecture available on YouTube. And thank you everyone for joining us today. It was a pleasure having you, Paul. I could look at those photos for much longer. For our next lecture, titled as Cosmetality by Gökhan Kodelek, Theorist will be on Monday, July 11th at 11 a.m. New York time. For your information, we had the link in the chat if you want to register. And please stay connected. T-Space doors are always open to visitors for a great tour of the gallery and the beautiful property T-Space is located at. Thank you again, everyone, and looking forward to seeing you all in our next lecture. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Paul.